Okay, good morning. My name is Sheila Jackson. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist with the TOPS program, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We are pleased, as always, to have Tim Frankenberger, CEO and co-founder of Tango International, with us. Tim has done numerous resilience events on resilience for TOPS, but we're always happy to have one more to hear the latest thinking and research around resilience. So today, Tim will be speaking on measuring resilience in Asian urban and rural settings. Please note there will be Q&A after Tim's presentation, so write down your questions, your comments, get ready. He will be answering them, hopefully. Just kidding, Tim. Also, today's session is being streamed out live, so I'd like to say a special good morning to our folks who are online with us. And please, when you are talking, whether you're giving a presentation, commenting, or asking a question, talk loudly so the people online can hear what you're saying. Also, for the people online, please type in your questions into the chat box, and we will be saying those out loud to have Tim answer your questions as well. As been accustomed to all TOPS events, we are recording this. So if you know someone who wasn't able to get here today, or if you want to go ahead and watch it again, listen again, we will be posting the link to the recording along with Tim's presentation on the FSN Network website. That's fsnnetwork.org, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the website. We also, as our custom, will send out an email to all participants giving you the links to the materials. Also, Tim is the chair of our newly formed TOPS Resilience Task Force, and there happens to be a meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. here at Save the Children. We are also streaming that meeting for those who maybe cannot get here. If you want more information and details, please go to the FSN Network website to get those details. All are welcome. Okay, so you know what's coming. All of you have been here before. We're TOPS. We're all into that participatory and making those right relationships and connections. So we're going to do an icebreaker. And people online, we haven't forgotten about you too. So what I want you to do is pair up with someone, probably someone you don't know, and introduce yourself, name, organization, and why you are interested in today's presentation. And people online, we do have a poll for you. So please get up and go meet your neighbor. Make a new friend, please. No. Lori. Hi. Sarah. Hi. With I'm with here. All right. You guys I know they've heard that. Okay, so if I could call you all back now. Time to start. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your participation. And so now is usually the part where we further embarrass you by asking you to introduce the person you just met and why they're here. But this time we're going to do it a little different. I'm going to look to our online audience and get the results out of the poll. So could I ask Adrian or Lauren to go ahead and give the results of the poll, please?
Yeah, so organizations where they're coming from, we have about 13 people online, and people are from ADRA International, Project Concern, Samaritans First, DFS, About Associates, Tango. We have a couple of people from TOP as well, Mercy Corps, Chemonic, and Save the Children.
Wow, yeah, wonderful. So great representation online as well as here in the room. So without further ado, let's get to the main event. I want to welcome Tim Frankenberger as he presents, Should Resilience be Contextualized and Measured Differently in Asian, Rural, and Urban Contexts?
Don't clap afterwards. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I almost didn't make it. I almost was suffering a systems failure on Delta yesterday. So the systems thinking really drove home last night. One of the things that I also want to point out is there seems to be kind of two areas where people are focusing on resilience. Those that are focused more on household and communities and rural areas, and those that are more focused on cities and urban, trying to measure urban resilience in cities. And so what we're trying to do is bring these two groups together in this talk. So we had a workshop with Mercy Corps in Philippines where we brought together a number of different countries, missions, but also the technical partners that were implementing programs, and tried to go through what are the differences and similarities between rural and urban areas. And so a lot of this talk is based on the training that we just provided, and we'll make those training materials available for everybody so that you can have access to it. One of the things that those of you that work in Asia know that chronic vulnerability is a serious problem, both in rural and urban areas in Asia. We've got 1/3 of the people living in extreme poverty, and that's up to 60% in Bangladesh, but in Indonesia and in Philippines, it's up to 30%. Many of you are aware of all of the recent shocks that have been happening in these areas. We had the earthquake in Nepal. We've had tsunamis over and over again in a number of places. We've had major flooding going on. In fact, recently there was some major flooding going on in Asia where a lot of people have recently died. We also know that population pressure is increasing dramatically in this area, and climate change is still a huge problem for a lot of people in the region, and water and land scarcity are becoming more and more significant as population grows. The impact is that we're seeing food insecurity going up. We're seeing competition over resources. We're seeing that income is what we're seeing is kind of a bimodal distribution where we have a very large urban poor population and a few very rich people in these cities. We're seeing a lot of migration and displacement, and that puts pressure on both systems. We're also seeing a huge amount of debt, and we've also experiencing more governance and corruption problems in a number of these places. We know that urbanization is occurring rapidly in Asia, and by 2050, 64% of the population will be living in urban areas. So if your organization isn't into urban right now, you probably will be moving into urban in the next couple of years. So it's important to kind of be ready for that. We're seeing that there's an increased demand for infrastructure and services, but we also know that as the population density increases in these areas, it becomes very difficult for these services to be provided, particularly for non-formal settlements where a lot of the poor people are moving to. These cities were built along coastal areas to have easy access to markets, but these coastal areas are also the ones that get slammed by hurricanes, typhoons, by tsunamis. So they're more exposed to these extreme weather events. And we're also seeing that it's very difficult as these cities become megacities for the governance system to actually mitigate the negative impacts on many of these neighborhoods. So you're taxing, I mean, those of you who have recently been in Dhaka, you know that it's way overextended in terms of the number of people living in that area. Same with Manila, same with, almost any city we can name in Asia is like that. So what we want to do is we want to see how do we address this resilience deficit. We're seeing that it's in the billions of dollars that people are losing assets. We're also seeing more people dying from these extreme events than ever before. So we want to know, okay, how do we build resilience across households, communities, and systems, and across these two different geographical areas, these rural and urban areas? And do we need different conceptual frameworks or measurement frameworks to do that? So we know that there's been two lines of thought. Those that have been working more in cities have been developing their own conceptual frameworks, and those that have been working in rural areas have been using their other conceptual frameworks and measurement frameworks. So do we need to have two different sets, or can we use the same sets? And our argument is that we can use the same sets. We just have to take into consideration the differences in context. So starting with USAID's definition of resilience, resilience is defined as the ability of people, households, communities, and countries and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. The definition for resilience that Rockefeller uses, particularly for its urban city investments, is very similar. The kinds of definition that recently came out of the technical working group on resilience measurement also is very similar. And these all emphasize that there's a vulnerable population that's exposed to shocks and stresses that we're interested in and trying to help, that we're interested in the kinds of capacities that people use to manage these shocks and stresses, both to absorb the shock, to adapt to the shock, and to transform to the shock, and that we're interested in development outcomes, how people actually use their capacities to try to maintain their food security or maintain nutritional outcomes or income levels so that they can actually meet their needs effectively. So all of the different definitions pretty much encompass these three major pieces. What we want to do is start with a similar framework for both contexts. So we're interested, and this is built on what Mercy Corps has been working on through the STRESS program, their stress measurement technique. We want to know resilience for whom. So we have to be very clear who our target population is that we're going to be working with. So the vulnerable and marginalized populations in a given context that are exposed to shocks and stresses. That doesn't mean that the interventions that we work in have to be based on those populations. You can work through other means to help those populations, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. Resilience of what? Okay, we want to make sure that the systems that are operating in an area are able to withstand these shocks and stresses so that people can continually meet their development goals by having those systems be able to respond to those shocks and stresses. We have a range of shocks and stresses that people are exposed to. So resilience to what? Resilience to these types of shocks and stresses. And resilience through what? This is where your interventions that you engage in have to build up the capacities of people so that they can manage these shocks and stresses more effectively. And finally, we're interested in development outcomes. What are people trying to achieve in the face of these shocks and stresses? These tend to be the impact level indicators that we normally are monitoring as part of our programs. So if you start from this basic premise, that when you are designing a resilience program, you need to know who you're targeting. You need to understand the context and systems that people are embedded in. You need to understand what are the kinds of shocks and stresses that they're exposed to. What kinds of capacities can we build to enable them to manage those shocks and stresses? And how do we measure the development outcomes that will make sure that we're achieving what we say we are in relationship to those shocks and stresses? So what happened? Uh-oh, systems failure. Delta took over.
1 second, sorry.
Battery failure? No, I think it's a systems failure. There we go. Okay, so these to whom, through, to what, through what, all of this is illustrated by this graphic that Mercy Corps has developed, which is based on a Tango resilience conceptual framework that we had developed earlier. But we're resilience for whom, resilience of what, resilience to what, resilience through what, and then these outcomes that we're interested in. Again, we will share the paper that this is in with all of you. So when we talk about resilience for whom, in rural areas, we're talking a lot about landless households, female-headed households with high dependency ratios, households that are vulnerable to these shocks and stresses. They can be poor or non-poor. They could be both. But also the businesses that are employing the poor and near poor. We're trying to make sure that those businesses stay and function effectively. In urban areas, we have recent rural migrants. We have emerging middle-class households that are vulnerable to these shocks and stresses. We have women in informal settlements. We have women and adolescents at risk of being trafficked, and then business employing poor and near poor. So again, depending on which urban area you're talking about, there will be different kinds of vulnerable groups in those urban areas. We just want to make sure that we're clear about which target group we're actually working with. So one of the things that's really important in urban areas is that urban areas are not the same in terms of capacities across all of the different neighborhoods. And so some neighborhoods have more capacity than others to manage these shocks and stresses. We know that places where you have very strong social capital, where people are well connected, this is through the work that Aldrich has done in a number of different countries, he's found that in neighborhoods where you have very strong social capital, people will be able to manage these shocks and stresses more effectively, or at least recover from the shocks and stresses more effectively, than in places where you have very poor social capital and a large transient population. So we need to understand these differences of vulnerability across neighborhoods. Not every neighborhood is the same in its ability to manage the shocks and stresses. Informal settlements, those that the city government may not exactly recognize, are also the ones that are very vulnerable because they don't have access to basic services. Those of you who have worked in any urban areas in Asia know those places located along railroad tracks or on garbage dumps. Those are the ones where the city doesn't really want people living in, but so they don't have good access to health care, they don't have good access to roads or sanitation or any of these other things that are services provided by the city. We also see greater economic disparities in urban areas. So as I said before, you have this bimodal distribution where you have a very large poor population and some very rich guys, but not much in the middle. And so what we want to do is try to understand that the poor populations in these urban areas and how vulnerable they are to these shocks and stresses. The other thing that's very unique about urban areas is there's a cycle of indebtedness that occurs when you're in wage labor and you don't make enough money throughout the month. So you get into debt before the end of the month, you have to borrow, and then you're paying back the loan when you get paid at the end of the month. So you're constantly in debt, kind of a cycle of debt. So this is a unique kind of thing for urban wage earners. We also know that there is a lot of rural-urban linkages that are important to take into account. So, for example, we know that labor migrates from rural areas to urban areas for jobs. We have a lot of exchange of food and commodities between urban and rural areas. We have remittances that are coming from urban areas back to rural areas. So what happens when a shock hits in the rural areas? Let's start with the rural area. Okay, you get low rainfall in the rural area, which leads to low food production in the rural area, which means the food supply going to the urban area is in short supply, which increases the food prices for the urban area because they have to import food from somewhere else. Low food production in rural areas will also lead to rural migration to the city because people need to find work to be able to compensate for the production shortfall. This creates more labor market competition, drives the wages down so that people don't make as much, it depresses wages, and it makes it more difficult for them to provide remittances back. So these rural-urban connections are really important to understand. So when you have more rural-urban migration, there's a lot of pressure on the employment, there's pressure on the basic services because there's too many people that the services are trying to provide for, there's pressure on housing and infrastructure. We also know that economic shocks that hit the urban area can have a negative impact on the rural areas. So what we see is when you have decreased employment because of the economic shock, we see decreased remittances going back to rural areas. We also see that when the market chain breaks down in the urban areas, we have an increased prices for equipment, inputs, and food that goes back to the rural areas. So it's not an either-or thing. We need to understand this as a bigger systems level approach. There are a number of complex and multi-layered systems in urban areas that are different than we find in rural areas. So what's important is to have a pretty good understanding of these different systems in urban areas. So we have land and natural resource access in urban areas, infrastructure, governance. Now, governance is an important one because you have this layering of governance. So you have national governance, you have regional governance, and you have local governance. I think Washington, D.C. is a perfect example of that. So if a flood hits in D.C., you know, there are different governance agencies that are responsible for responding to that flood. So an example that we had in Batangas, Philippines, was there was a huge typhoon that hit Batangas. It took out a bridge. The city wanted to rebuild the bridge, but it was not in the city's jurisdiction to rebuild the bridge because it belonged to the jurisdiction of the national government. But the national government had higher priorities from other areas, so it took a long time to rebuild that bridge. So essentially, half of the city was cut off for more than a year because the national government wouldn't rebuild the bridge. So these different jurisdictions are important to understand, not only for who's in charge of which infrastructure or which roads or which systems, but also how fast they actually respond in enabling people to get back on their feet. That goes for security, that goes for the kinds of information, the kinds of public services. All of this is important to understand these different levels of jurisdiction. And so when you have this conflict between local, regional, and national, it can lead to these conflicts over jurisdiction. And I already talked about how that affected these roads and bridges. It also can delay emergency response. So how many people remember Katrina, sorry.
Oh.
How slow the government, national government was in responding to that one. Okay, so that's a good example of jurisdiction differences. Huh? Okay. So one of the things that private sector and city governments constantly are dealing with is this trade-off between efficiency and redundancy. What do we mean by redundancy? Does anybody want to take a shot at answering that? Yes.
Making sure that something is not replicated, so you don't have services that are replicated. They'll go through the budgets and say, okay, these guys are already taking care of that, or let's reduce the number of units so that we, we'll get economies of scale, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's another, and that's one definition of redundancy. The other one is backup systems, basically.
Yeah.
Your redundant systems are ones that are resilient.
Right.
You can back up the failing ones.
What Delta lacked yesterday.
Yeah.
That's right.
Exactly.
So one of the problems in this, give it another example of Batangas, Philippines, there was only one bridge that connected the main supply route to the city. And once that bridge was taken out, it was very difficult for the private sector to get resupplied for a lot of the things that they needed. So they needed two bridges. They needed one that, if one went out, the other one would still function. So the private sector figured that out, that it needed to do that. So they mobilized resources through loans to be able to help the city build another bridge, because their own private sector would not be able to function otherwise. So, but efficiency and redundancy are things governments are always struggling with, because you don't want to have a lot of duplicate systems, but at the same time, if one goes, you want to make sure you've got one that functions. So, how much you do on this is important to work out. The other thing about cities and urban areas is they have a lot of stakeholders. And so there's a lot of people in power, as you know, anytime you have government systems. So you have individuals with formal and informal power, institutions with informal and informal power. So it's really important in any kind of urban setting to make sure you do a careful mapping out as who are the key stakeholders in the urban system that have some kind of role in decision making. Because you're going to have to get them on board if you're going to strengthen these systems so that they can manage shocks and stresses more effectively. We know that urban areas and rural areas are both affected by climate shocks and stressors, but we also know that the urban area is affected by a number of other shocks and stressors that are kind of unique. So pollution, air, water, soil, has a lot to do with the fact that we have a lot of people using energy and creating a lot of waste. And so that has a lot of health impacts in the city. We also know that because they're so densely populated that disease pandemics can be very significant in urban areas. So you can get a cholera epidemic that takes off very quickly. Other stressors on basic services from migrant influx, particularly if you have a lot of people living in informal settlements, it's very difficult for the city to provide those kinds of basic services to those informal settlements. The impact of the economic shocks on the cash economy. Because most people are relying on cash to buy their goods and services, they are very vulnerable when there's a significant problem in inflation or a significant market failure globally. And so they can be very stressed out in terms of these economic shocks. And because there's so many people located in one location, if you have a lot of these shocks and stressors and they don't feel like the government is responding effectively to it, that's where you get a lot of political unrest and violence. And in most governments, at least the ones I know of, are very worried about urban populations, because that's where most of the revolution actually starts. So they want to make sure that even at the sacrifice of rural areas, urban area populations are taken care of. So we need to understand the enabling political environment. And we know that if we've got a large proportion of our population in urban areas that are living in slums of these informal settlements, it's going to be very difficult for the government, city governments, to actually put the infrastructure, the basic services in place to protect those populations from shocks and stresses. So it's a constant dilemma that these cities are dealing with. You know, the most vulnerable people are the people they do not want to provide basic services to. And if you don't provide basic services to them, then they're going to be negatively impacted by these shocks and stresses. There are three kinds of capacities that work in both rural and urban areas that are important. So those of you who have heard me talk before talk about these three kinds of capacities: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. So absorptive capacity, we're trying to minimize the sensitivity to a shock in the short term. You can build infrastructure such as seawalls, flood canals, and dams that protect urban areas. You can have disaster risk planning and already have mapped out evacuation routes. What was really interesting, I was just on vacation in in Portland, and I noticed this year, more than 4 years ago, that they had all the tsunami evacuation routes mapped out and on big signs all over the place. So they must be expecting a big tsunami soon, because I've never seen so many, especially on the coast, I've never seen so many signs. Disaster contingency funds and city budgets. Trying to make sure, so for example, what we found in Batanga, which is considered one of these model cities that's trying to manage shocks and stresses more effectively, they've allocated 10% of their budget, their city budget, for disaster response. So early warning systems, trying to make sure that people know soon enough so that they can get to those evacuation routes. Having savings and credit and insurance for marginalized urban dwellers so that they can get back on their feet after a shock hits. So it's not only dealing with trying to protect the population from shocks and stresses, but also trying to recover quickly from shocks and stresses. Adaptive, this is where we're trying to have proactively modified conditions and practices to prepare for or respond to shocks and stressors to reduce sensitivity and exposure in the medium term. So if we know that certain occupations are more likely to be vulnerable to shocks and stresses, how do we provide financial services and diversify livelihood skills so that they're not as exposed to these shocks and stresses? So the same thing for rural areas. We're trying to understand livelihood diversification away from certain risk profiles. If you are trying to make sure that people aren't exposed to climate change risk, you would have additional income earning opportunities and things that aren't exposed to climate risk. So same in urban areas. Some urban population activities or livelihoods are more vulnerable to shocks and stresses than others. So how do we build the skill levels and create financial opportunities for those urban businesses so that they are less exposed to these shocks and stresses. And then transformative, this is the big one for urban areas. We're really interested in the enabling conditions that facilitate systemic change in a positive environment in which people are willing and able to invest and innovate while managing risk. So we have a number of different governance systems and institutions that are operating in the urban areas. We want to make sure that those systems that are operating at multiple scales are not vulnerable to these shocks and stresses. And so we're trying to essentially look at what is their exposure to particular shocks and stresses and how can we actually make them less vulnerable to those shocks and stresses. As I said before, social capital is a big issue not only for rural areas but also for urban areas. And it helps you recover more quickly from covariant shocks. So I don't know how many of you living in D.C. have some kind of residential identity. In other words, do you really like the neighborhood you're living in, and do you know people in that neighborhood, and can you actually work together? These are things that are very important. This residential identity is important in urban areas. And part of it has to do with how you gather around church or school groups where you can use that bonding mechanism to help each other out. In places that you have a lot of transient populations where there's not people living there for very long, it's more difficult to build this social capital. It's more difficult to have these kind of linkages. So these different neighborhoods do have different levels of social capital, and that's important to take into account in not only responding to a shock, but recovering from a shock. And if you're going to be targeting urban areas, it's important to get a good feel for that. Now, in terms of measurement, in both rural and urban areas, we're interested in evidence and what factors contribute to resilience, in what context and what type of shocks. To be able to do that effectively, you need to be measuring stuff before the shock hits. So you need to have some notion of the states of capacity before the shock or stressor hits. You need to understand the disturbance component. What are the shocks and stresses that are hitting that area? And then did the subsequent state trajectories follow the shocks and stressors? Were people able to manage those shocks and stresses when they were exposed to them? So we have an ex ante, a disturbance, and an ex post component that was part of our M&E. So we're measuring stuff at multiple scales. So both urban and rural areas, we're interested in what resilience capacities people use to prepare for and respond. What kinds of resources do they actually use to do that? Are these indexed to some given well-being outcome that we're interested in, food security, nutrition, income? And is it observed at multiple levels? In other words, oftentimes urban frameworks do not focus on the individual and community level. They tend to focus more at the systems level, whereas rural frameworks tend to focus more on the household and community level, and not so much on the systems level. Even though we talk about it, we don't measure it that much. This is the resilience measurement framework that the technical working group on resilience measurement came up with. It just lays out what I just talked about, ex ante, disturbance, and ex post components. So, as I said before, these urban frameworks put less emphasis on household community level, more on systems, institutions, and policies, and they're more interested in measuring the quality of those systems and institutions, quality of the service delivery. We have both tangible and intangibles that we're measuring, and one of the big areas that we need a lot more work on is how to measure the effectiveness of these systems in managing shocks and stresses. So we've got some indicators that are tangible, but there's a lot of intangibles that we're still thinking through. So for example, trying to capture the social capital element in these different neighborhoods may be a difficult measurement issue for you. But we have a number of places where we're creating these indices. We want to know how prepared and how people respond. So we have indices around absorptive capacity. We want to know whether people are adapting to those shocks and stresses. So we have an indice around adaptive capacity. And we also want to know whether the enabling environment is there to be a transformative capacity. And I'm just listing here 2 examples of baseline studies that we've already created these indices around. We're still working on trying to create these for urban areas. And then the thing that's also important is we need to understand not just the capacities people have access to, but their actual responses. And so, to really measure post-shock recurrent responses, we need to have a good baseline. And then we need to be able to see, and then we need panel data that allows us to see what the difference is from the baseline after the shock, whether people's actual responses are there. So we've been able to carry out this kind of data in rural areas. We're proposing that this can also be done in urban areas. Any resilience measurement has to be embedded into a larger M&E framework. So what we are interested in is these resilience capacities and our intermediate outcomes that lead to responses to shocks and stresses, which are what we consider outcomes that impact well-being, which is impact. So I guess the key point here is that resilience measures, or resilience is a means, not an end goal. It's something we're working through to achieve an end goal. So improvements in well-being outcomes must be related to exposure to shocks and stressors and to these resilience capacities and responses to basically know whether or not a population is resilient or not. You have to have some kind of shocks and stresses that are intervening to know whether or not somebody is resilient to those shocks and stresses. The Mercy Corps stress approach is an excellent approach for allowing us to take these factors into account in designing an intervention. So we can identify the key systems constraints and shocks and stresses that impact development outcomes. We can define the impact of shocks and stresses on different population subgroups. We can understand how capacities of household community assistance are used to manage these shocks and stresses. And this will enable us to develop a resilience-focused theory of change. So all of these components that I've been talking about are embedded in this stress approach that they have come up with. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and take some questions. First thing, do we have anything online yet, ladies?
We are just asking, so nothing yet.
All right, anybody in the room have a question? And please remember to speak loudly. Adam.
Sure. Tim, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear what you have to say. As you and I are both aware of, social capital is extremely important, and through your knowledge, I have learned that we need to really work on different ways to build that up for the communities that we are working in. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some, you did have a little bit on this, but I would wonder if you could speak more on what kinds of things we can do, how about in rural settings, because that's where the majority of our funding flows to right now, how to build social capacity, social capital in these communities. Whether they're transient or otherwise, actually, if you address both, that'd be great, because we deal with IDPs and things like that more and more these days.
Yeah, I think one of the things that NGOs are very good at are creating groups, whether it be around savings groups or some kind of small business group or some kind of market group or some kind of production group. And I think what we need to do is, as we create these opportunities for households to share and engage in working together in some kind of collective action, we need to have some way of measuring whether or not social capital has gotten better. And one of the things that I always look for when I see that is maybe we create a group around savings, so we have one function, but these savings groups now are doing other things together. They're starting to market their products together. They're starting to take care of the natural resources together, preventing people from overgrazing. They're starting to help each other out when shock hits. And so those are examples of social capital increasing because you created one thing. But we often, as NGOs, we don't measure those things. We only measure whether the function that we focused on was actually improved or not. Okay, so I think we missed a lot of opportunity to actually see how social capital gets built up in these communities. And this is particularly relevant in places where social capital is really weak and people aren't used to doing things together. I think that there's real ways to start, and I think there are lots of examples from different NGOs of how they've done this effectively in a number of locations. So I think one of the first things I would do as Food for Peace or implementing partners for Food for Peace is start accumulating case studies of how social capital actually was improved in areas and what mechanisms were used to do that.
But that presupposes us being able to measure it, right?
Oh, there are ways to measure it, yeah.
I'll take Sujata and then we'll take a question online.
Yes, just wanted to ask, when we're talking about social capital, is the thinking still largely having to do with non-transient populations, or are you also thinking about, have you started conceptualizing the development and measurement of social capital among transient or displaced or temporary sort of populations?
You know, it's more difficult with transient populations, but I think that's exactly what Adam was asking. I think there is a way to capture that by creating these groups and then tracking what happens to these groups over time.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Online, please. So they kind of have similar questions, both of these, but they also wanted to expand on that and see how can we work to build social capital among refugees. Is that possible?
Yeah. Well, why do I get asked all the time? Well, that's tough. Again, I would respond in a similar way. I mean, I think that in refugee camps, you're trying to create opportunities for people to collaborate around certain activities. So you're looking for opportunities for collective action, whether that be savings groups or maybe it's taking care of the grounds in terms of keeping it clean or whatever. But I think that we have to look for opportunities to bring groups together so that they can actually do collective action together, and then we need to track it in terms of measuring what happens to those groups in terms of other functions.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was interesting. Just thinking about how the details of the measurement in an urban context, I think, is really interesting in itself, because I know that, you know, Tango and Mercy Corps, having worked to really refine the measurement models, I think I remember it as being maybe not a breakthrough, but a really important part when the Resilience Technical Working Group determined it has to be indexed against a specific outcome, and to date, that's been food security. And I think, you know, that makes sense. We're all food security organizations working for or with a donor that's the primary priority is food security. But it seems in an urban context that may be called into question, right? So the context of chronic food insecurity, acute food insecurity in urban areas is going to be quite a bit different. So I just wonder if there's some thought that maybe it would be indexed against, say, economic status or housing quality or something like that, those things that really make the difference in vulnerability to pandemic disease or disempowerment.
No, I think that's good. That's a good point. I think I know that Mercy Corps has been trying it out with other outcomes that they've been trying to measure. So yes, they have been looking at economic well-being type outcomes, and we have too, by the way. You know, food security was the focus for the technical working group because the Rome-based agencies that we were working closely with are both food security oriented, so FAO and WFP. But it doesn't mean that the measurement can't have other kinds of outcomes that we're tracking. Yeah.
John.
I just, since you feel all alone up there, I wanted to mention things that I've learned over the years of your work on resilience. I think one of the challenges to social capital and collective action is the distrust that exists, and especially in emergency situations. So I think a lot of the pushes for transparency on our part and real consultative processes with local leaders' involvement. I think WFP was praised for a while in Tanzania in having community leaders very much involved in figuring out who needed what and who needed more. So besides creating the context that facilitates it.
Yeah. Right.
We have another question online?
Yeah, so Karen Fox from Tango commented that, you know, the notion of urban identity is interesting as it relates to social capital. She's more interested to hear about measurement approaches and indicators to measure urban identity?
Yeah, you know, the people that have been working on that much longer than me are sociologists that really work in urban areas. But I know that there was, again, I would go back to people like Aldridge, who have been looking at these issues. Some of the work that Nancy Mock has been doing with Katrina in New Orleans, I think also really focuses on urban identity issues.
Krishna.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm definitely not a world's expert on that, for sure. There's a lot of people that I defer to on that.
Megan, so you mentioned a lot of different factors that you have to look at. And I'm thinking now of emergency context particularly, but also, I mean, on the development programs. We have a slew of questions we're already asking these people. And when we're trying to get to the social capital piece, and then these additional kind of connections that they may have, urban and rural, are there actual tools here in the measurement that you suggest that are practical that we might be able to use that don't involve another 200 questions, but maybe 20? I'm thinking also of the time of the people that we interact with,
Sure.
Because these are quite long things already.
Again, I would like to all have you focus on the stress tool that was developed by Mercy Corps. I think it's fairly straightforward in the way it's used. I think it's not too complicated. It relies a lot on social mapping as part of what it's doing. And we use it in a couple of settings now for training, and we found that people that were totally unfamiliar with it were able to use it fairly effectively to look at not only linkages between kind of systems linkages, but also how you could actually put together a theory of change on the basis of that approach, so you can identify where the key investments should be made to bring about more resilience. So I think that tool is very helpful for that purpose. I think we're also, as we get more measurement under our belt in different countries, we're going to start narrowing down. You know, right now we've got more than 200 questions we're asking, so we're trying to narrow down the list a little bit more as we figure out which things seem to be more important across locations. But we needed to have, we needed to make sure that we had the exhaustive list in the first 5 or 6 measurements, because you could find out if you start eliminating it after the first measurement activity, you might be missing some really important things in other countries that should be captured. So you need several across locations, across contexts before you can start narrowing down the list of indicators that you're actually going to look at. But I think in the next 6 months to a year, we will have a much smaller list that we will focus on that will make it a little bit more streamlined in the way that the data collection that you actually end up doing.
Next question. Tom again?
So just thinking in the area of data collection, it seems like it's very tricky, right? You mentioned panel data, and if we're looking at the systems level, then sampling becomes an interesting question too, right? To make sure that it's valid data.
Well, that was for recurrent monitoring, right? So I think one of the things that we've found is that you can get an awful lot of information on these different systems through qualitative data collection techniques. You know, spending a little time talking to people that are actually in charge of these systems, trying to understand how the systems actually function, and then you can identify a couple of key variables that you would want to track that let you know whether the system is able to respond effectively to the shock or not. And we found that when we had the team going into Batanga to interview a number of people that were in charge of these systems, that it was pretty easy to identify 3 or 4 things that you would want to track to see how they hold up when the next typhoon hits.
Tim, I know you and Olga recently ran a couple of workshops in Asia on this topic, and I'm wondering to what extent this presentation was prepared for those workshops, and to what extent it's informed by the discussions in those workshops, and if the former, whether there was anything in those workshops that has really lifted understanding.
Yeah. So when we okay. So just to give you a little background, we did our first workshop in Cambodia, and it was mainly focused on rural areas. Okay, and so we were using the measurement framework, the conceptual frameworks, and showing how in these rural areas this is important information that you need to collect. Then we had the team go out and actually collect it from a number of rural areas and come back and analyze the data. We did the same thing in the urban area. We wanted to see if these conceptual models and measurement frameworks held up in urban areas. And so the same thing, we had them go out and collect it. And that's, so yes, this talk was very much informed by the training of those two workshops, but also kind of reflecting a little bit more about what are the differences between these two areas that need to be taken into account. So I recommend highly that you guys, if you're interested in this stuff, we have the training materials that will be made available on the FSN network, both for the rural and the urban training. And there's a bunch of PowerPoint slides to go with that training. So you can do your own training on the basis of that, I think. So we're willing to share all of that. That was part of what this was all about. But one of the things that's been important for me is most of the resilience measurement that I've been involved in has mostly been focused on Africa. So we've been doing the work in Ethiopia, we've been doing the work in Kenya, Uganda, Somalia recently, West Africa with the RISE program, Burkina and Niger, and also in Zimbabwe. So a lot of the measurement work that we're doing around resilience has been pretty African focused. We wanted to do these Asian workshops to see what could be applied from Africa into Asia, what was different in Asia that needed to be taken into account. So what we tried to highlight in these workshops is what's different in the measurement issues in Asia versus Africa, and why you should make these changes in the way that you approach it in Asia. The other thing that's important here is that, I don't know how many of you know this, but there's been a huge investment in urban resilience measurement by Rockefeller over the last many years. And they've been working hard on trying to come up with a measurement framework for cities in a number of Asian cities that they're working on. And so what we're trying to do is build on the work that's already gone on, and most of that work has been more systems focused, trying to capture the dimensions of systems that you need to be tracking that show whether or not a city is resilient. But what we're trying to say is that by being too systems focused and not actually looking at the implications of that for communities and households, you can miss a big part of the resilience picture. Just as the rural areas, if you're too focused on households and communities and you don't take the larger system stuff into account, you could be also focusing maybe not on all the right things when you're trying to build resilience. So we're trying to learn from both sides and bring them together. So the best of the systems thinking and the best of the household community thinking into the same framework. And so our argument is that there doesn't need to be two separate initiatives here, that they actually should come together.
I'm just wondering in the workshops and in the meetings, if there was any discussion around considerations around caste and ethnicity, both in the rural and then also the urban context, things that we should consider when we're kind of designing a specific tool or questionnaire.
Yeah, I think social exclusion is a big part of what's going on in Asia that's different from a lot of the Africa places that we work, although there are still social exclusion problems in Africa. But I'd say it'd be more pronounced in a lot of the Asian places that we're working in, like Nepal, for example. And so I think, yes, that is definitely one of those contextual factors that needs to be taken into account. I think what's really important in any of these things is that we're not trying to find one size fits all. What we're trying to get you to think about is what's unique about this particular context that you need to take into account when you're identifying vulnerable populations, when you're trying to figure out what systems you need to be working on, trying to figure out what kinds of shocks and stresses are key to that context, and what are the development outcomes that you're actually trying to reach. And one of the things that we often make mistakes in NGOs, and I can say that because I used to work for CARE, is that we tend to design the program in the context of the population that we're trying to work with without really seeing other mediaries that
we could be working with that could make the difference on helping that population. So here's a classic example. If we know that a population living in an urban area is exposed to floods all the time, and the sanitation conditions are so bad that cholera breaks out all the time in those areas, you wouldn't necessarily try to solve the problem by just working one-on-one with the community. You would want to work very closely with the water and sanitation department in the city to try to help make sure that that problem is addressed. So it's a higher assistance level response to trying to help the population that you're trying to target. So the means to the end isn't necessarily only working with the group at the end. I don't know if I was clear about that.
So I find it interesting. So when you're talking about the rural versus the urban context, in the rural, we've really focused on, in a lot of the papers that have come out, on absorptive and adaptive capacity. But the more you talk about systems and, in a rural setting, NGOs are focused on households and communities. Urban is different. So do you think that we're going to improve the tools that we use to track transformative capacity? Because I know we've struggled with it. In terms of capturing that.
Yeah, that's the next frontier, if you will, of resilience measurement, is trying to do a better job at measuring systems, how systems function, both in rural and urban areas. And what are the key indicators that you want to track, both the tangible and the intangibles. So we're recognizing that we need to do a better job in understanding these systems level indicators.
Before Mark, could I get Carol? Is it?
Yes. So we have a project that's just getting started up, and they want to develop a resilience framework and indicator, and so they want to use a similar sort of framework with the absorptive and adaptive, but they feel like it's too soon to really measure the transformative. And so I told them, they should go ahead and, because they'll want some sort of baseline data to use in the future, but they just want to focus on the absorptive and adaptive right now. And do you think will that work? Well, I mean, will it make? It doesn't really make sense to me, but.
No, I think even though it's not perfect, there are ways to capture the transformative capacity. We know that we've been measuring this in rural areas. We know that we could get better at it, but we know that it does make a difference. And what's important here is that it's the enabling conditions that allow adaptive and absorptive capacity to work. If you don't have the enabling conditions in place, then the next major covariant shock that hits, those absorptive and adaptive capacities will be overwhelmed. So you need to have that transformative capacity in your site, and need to be trying to measure it as best you can. Now there are tools out there already. So for example, the ASORN project has been really focused on trying to capture the indicators on that transformative capacity stuff, that systems level stuff. So it's worth looking at some of the work that they've been doing. AREP is another measurement framework that has also been trying to capture those transformative capacity things for urban areas. We've been capturing it through access to basic services, whether or not there are formal safety nets available. We have a number of different indicators that we're using, market systems indicators, and we think we can improve upon those, but we have shown, though, in a number of our studies that those things do make a difference. And so we think that those should be part of what you're measuring. But those are the things that take the longest to change. And so when we talk about resilience programming, usually you can deal with the absorptive and adaptive in a 3 to 5 year time frame. Transformative, we're talking 10 to 15 years. So what you need to be thinking about is how your projects all fit into a larger strategy. In other words, if you are sequencing project activities in an area, you have a longer-term resilience strategy for that area so that you're trying to strengthen those transformative capacities, but it will take time to do that.
Mark, and then we have a question online.
Right. Well, and it's not quite a question so much as it is kind of a comment or observation, but it seems to me that, obviously, qualitatively, urban-focused projects that are, resilience projects are going to be more dependent on systems than the kinds of systems than you would see in a rural area, perhaps, because of their dependence on the infrastructure, water, sanitation, electricity, transportation, and so on, flood control. And I guess it seems to me that if you're going to be working a project in those areas, that the design has to include early on actors in those systems as actually part of that project, as a way of also being able to identify your basic indicators that you can then track later on. Are those actors delivering on their aspect of this? So it seems that the partnership relationships in putting together a project in an urban area would be significantly different in some ways, because you have to bring in systems, but also to a large degree, I think, just thinking intuitively about it, is the political system, political structure. And I'm mainly just reflecting on my time living in Jakarta.
Sure.
And the neighborhoods there are really coherent, cohesive neighborhoods, but to the degree to which they were dependent on multiple different political parties to access resources out of the pot of resources available to the city to be able to deal with things like floods and so on. And it becomes really mind-bogglingly complicated, but you need to have those things to measure, those, I guess you would call them transformative indicators, right in the beginning.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, maybe I glossed over too fast, the importance of stakeholder analysis and trying to understand that you have all of these different actors that have different levels of decision making that it could be key to whether or not a system functions properly or not. So you need to have a good understanding of these power relationships that have to do with these stakeholders. Second, what you were talking about just there is what we call linking social capital. So a neighborhood that actually has the ability to draw on an agency for assistance or help, or to bring in a basic service that might have broken down. That's linking social capital, which is important. It's not just the bonding social capital within the neighborhood, but your ability to draw on connections that you have with the government to get those services in place. That's a big part of being resilient for recovery, particularly. So, I think, and even bridging social capital, so how one neighborhood actually interacts with another neighborhood is also critical, particularly if that other neighborhood can help them out if they have a strong connection to another neighborhood. So that's why neighborhoods have these linkages between each other as well. So understanding how social capital plays out in urban areas, understanding how these different stakeholders play a key role in decision-making with regards to systems functioning is a very big part of what your analysis is about.
And political relations become even more and more touchy or sensitive up those settings.
Right. One question, please. So, first of all, for the enabling conditions, are you primarily referring to policies, laws, and interventions, or are you also referring to other things as well?
Enabling conditions are definitely policies and institutions, but also infrastructure. It could also be planning that goes on in terms of how people, do they have contingency plans in place that can be activated when certain indicators show up? All of those are part of the enabling conditions.
And then also for, have you seen how religious belief systems shape the responses to adversities? For example, fatalism in some belief systems versus others, and how do you try to overcome that?
I'm not so sure. We try to actually look at that in rural areas. I haven't done it in urban areas. But one of the problems that we've had is this is all part of aspirations, trying to measure aspirations. And when you're trying to determine whether people feel like they have a locus of control or whether they feel that they don't have control, that's a very culturally sensitive issue to be asking about. And what we found in surveys that we've done in Somalia, it hasn't worked out so well to try to ask those questions, whereas in Ethiopia we were able to do it. So it varies from one context to the other. So I haven't got an answer for that one yet.
Okay. Next question, comment?
I actually had one. So Tim, you were talking about how you feel that, resilience in the rural and the urban context, that they need to kind of work together. Have you so far, after starting this research and everything, found any parts of commonality for that collaboration to begin?
Well, that's interesting. It's rare to find an NGO that's working in both those contexts simultaneously. You either have NGOs that are working in urban areas or you have NGOs working in rural areas. I don't think we've done enough where we've actually designed programs that look at those relationships between those two. And I think that more could be done around that. So, so when you step back and you look at the broader system of how rural-urban linkages occur and how a shock in one area affects the other area, and what are the systems dynamics that are going on there. I think there has been a little bit of that in Somalia. I've seen a little bit of that in some of the NGO work in Somalia, but I'm hard-pressed to name places where I've seen that done effectively. Now, CARE in Bangladesh actually did some work looking at secondary cities in urban areas, but that hasn't happened that was like 10 years ago. That's the last time I saw that. So more could be done around that.
Anybody else? Comments, questions, anything from online?
Well, John just made a comment on
John Kurtz.
Magistro, yes. That in working with the resource Pentagon or resource capacities, he has seen little to date on psychosocial capital that address the psychological impact of shocks and stresses. And I guess he wants to know if there have been interventions that have been introduced to build more psychological well-being.
There's there are some recent work that's been done around this. It's under the label subjective resilience. So there was a recent ODI paper that's come out on this, and there's also been some work that we've been engaged in looking at psychosocial factors across different locations, and that paper is under current revision. So as soon as that is available, we'll make that available for people.
No? Okay, great. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. Especially like to thank Tim. Very nice presentation. And also, there's a lot of people who make this event work, and I just want to acknowledge them right now. First of all, we have Lauren, Adrian, Colin, and UC Songo Williams. So thank you for all the TAPS events. You did a great job with these. And and also, just a couple of things. Remember, there is a Resilience Task Force meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. here at Save the Children. We are also offering an online version for people who can't get there. Check out the FSN Network website, fsnnetwork.org, for more information. And we will, by the end of the week, send you an email with a link to the recording and Tim's presentation materials.
Also, the paper that this presentation is based on will be available on the FSN Network.
Well, okay, great. We'll get that to you, too. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, whether you're online or in the room. We really appreciate it. See you next time.
Thank you.